Okay. Hi, everyone. Feel free to have your cameras on or off as you like. Um, Welcome. My name is Holly Jarman. I am an associate professor of health management and policy at the University of Michigan in the School of Public Health. And I'm a trained political scientist, so a lot of what I do is around regulatory politics and tobacco control policy. And today I'll be talking a little bit about public comments in my capacity for as one of the policy leads for the Center for the Assessment of Tobacco Regulations. We have a policy and dissemination core within our CASTA Center. And so it's our job to try to figure out good ways to disseminate some of the findings that are coming out of the research in the center. And so we thought it would be a great idea to have a seminar talking a bit about public comments, particularly specific to proposed tobacco and nicotine rules. And yeah, I do a lot of policy engaged research, so this is my thing. I'm going to do my best to make this as exciting and engaging as I can. And especially, we have been working through some challenges and trying to come up with good solutions for crafting public comments when we have quite a technical set of research. We have a lot of modeling in our center. And so how do we communicate those technicalities? How do we communicate the evidence well and clearly and at a level that it is maximally useful to the FDA regulators? So please feel free while I'm talking to put comments in the chat or questions. I will stop for questions if we get some in the middle, and then I will make some time for a longer discussion and chat at the end. So let me start with a brief thoughts about why you should comment. Well, I hope that because you're here today, you want to be policy engaged. This public comment opportunities are really interesting because they really do make regulations better, but specifically if they are relevant, timely, targeted to the requests from agencies like FDA. And the more you can do that, the more becomes an opportunity for actually influencing policy. You really can, anyone can comment, and I think it's important to note sometimes I'm a US citizen now, but as an international person for many years as a researcher, it can be challenging to find opportunities where you feel like you can fully participate in the policy process. Public comment opportunities are one of those because anyone can comment regardless of their expertise, their organizational affiliation, their citizenship status, their residency. And in fact, sometimes it can be really useful to get those experiences and takes on evidence into the record. So anyone can comment. And I would say in the years I've been teaching, and I teach classes pretty regularly on public comment opportunities, it's become a lot easier to be able to respond to these opportunities. And I'm going to take you through a little bit how to find opportunities for comment, how to understand what you're seeing in databases like regulations.gov, how the user interface looks, as well as then talking about do's and don'ts in terms of writing and the substance of your comments. The pro-tobacco organizations will comment on these public opportunities. And so it's really important to, despite the fact that many of us are really busy researchers, to get our opinions entered into the record as well. So the technical part here is that there is a law that requires agencies to take comments into account. So under the Administrative Procedure Act, federal agencies, they have to tell us what actions they are going to take. They have to tell us what authority they have, so under law, to take those actions. And they are required to take comments into account when they make regulations that are timely, so submitted within a certain comment period, and relevant. So they have to be relevant to the questions that an agency like the FDA is asking. And there have to be responses to really significant regulatory issues that get raised through this process. So it's an opportunity in the moment to influence policy. It's also an opportunity because we are in a legal regulatory environment right now where we are likely to see a lot of legal challenges. In tobacco control, we're very used to policies being challenged through litigation. And so one of the extra uses of this evidence base that comes forth through people submitting public comments is during litigation. So this can be a means for people to who might be legal representatives of a particular position, go through, identify evidence. And so this is something that has the longevity that lasts beyond the public comment period. These are public records that are easy to search and they're accessible in that way. So don't be surprised if something that you submit might come out in the context of a legal case later on. So public comments are important. They're open access, and I'm strongly encourage you to try to build these into your projects as dissemination opportunities from an early stage. So I wanted to take folks through the basics of this public comment process. Of course, we like to, in public administration, use a lot of acronyms and some complicated jargon just to make it less easy to understand, but it's really a fairly simple process. So the rulemaking process, or to give it its proper name, the notice and comment rulemaking process, is building on laws that are passed by Congress and then turning those into regulations and detailed rules that govern the behavior of various actors. So in our case, we're very concerned about how this affects the tobacco industry and also how it affects public health. And it's issuing guidance for affected organizations. So the first thing to know is that agencies regularly publish a list of planned actions. And this is called the Unified Agenda. And you can find that, and I'll show you in a minute. We'll do a quick demo of where you can find that on the FDA website. And this happens in the fall. Occasionally, agencies may also publish some planned actions in the springtime. So plugging into the Unified Agenda helps you understand what's likely to be coming up next, and we have a useful list of what's happening. So we have a pre-rule stage before an action even appears on this Unified Agenda. There's a whole bunch of things that happen behind the scenes: information gathering, meetings with stakeholders, where the FDA staff are trying to understand the context of what they're proposing and put some substance around it. So sometimes an agency during that pre-rule stage will issue an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. So this is your first acronym, ANPRM. This tends to be for taking bigger steps. And it just indicates that there needs to be more information gathering, and the agency is trying to get that information from the public before moving forward with a proposed rule. We're going to talk a bit today about the nicotine standard, which was has been recently an important part of the rulemaking process, just as an example. And in that case, in proposing, before a proposed rule for the nicotine standard was even put forward, there was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking and a lot of evidence gathering by the agency. So the pre-rule stage has some informal stuff, and sometimes you'll see an ANPRM come on the website. The second stage is a proposed rule stage. So here the main document probably that you might have interacted with before, if you've done this before, would be a notice of proposed rulemaking, or an NPRM. So this is really the first proper step in the process. After that, these notices are massive documents. We're going to look a little bit at the anatomy of one and how that helps you to compose a good response that is responsive to the questions being asked a little bit later in the presentation. But this proposed rule is really probably where you will mostly start. There'll be a public comment period following the publication of that rule, which is at least 30 days. Quite often it's 60 days. It can be a different time period. And one of the important things to check is when you're planning to submit a comment, how much time do you have? And then what can you accomplish in that time period? So the agency will review the submitted comments and according to the requirements under law for them to do that. And then we'll end up with a final rule. So the agency will draft this final rule, and it's based partially on the public comments, which they have to take into account. It's partially based on agency discretion. And then also, this is normally passed through at least the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which could provide some scrutiny. Sometimes other parts of the President's office will also provide scrutiny. So the final rule that you get is a reflection of these different actors and their opinions. Two more things here to take into account, though. You will see that the example that we will cover today, which is the nicotine standard, has been moved into the category of long-term actions. So sometimes the FDA will, or another agency will indicate, well, there's a long-term action that we are investigating and may take in the future, but these long-term actions will not be associated with a specific time period. So they still want to notify stakeholders and the public, hey, this is something that's maybe on our agenda, but it's not in quite the same way tied to these three stages of pre-rule, proposed rule, and final rule. Something else that you might see is also completed actions. Completed actions can mean a number of things. Either the rulemaking's done and it's finalized, but in some cases recently we've seen rules that were under consideration, had been open for public comment, have been withdrawn. So those would also fall under completed actions. It's just that we don't have a final rule, a final action hasn't been taken. You can still find the documentation for most of those rules on the website, regulations.gov. So this is the basic process. I'm going to just show you very quickly. Here is a great place to go to understand how to find comment opportunities. So this is the FDA's track system. Which I would specifically maybe use over other, you can Google the unified agenda and find the agenda for the whole of government, but this is specific to FDA. And here you can subscribe to updates if you like. You can find things, so you can find things that are specific to tobacco, either by searching some keywords in the title maybe. If you do know a lot of these regulatory actions they'll be assigned a number called an RIN. If you do know that, you can put it in here, but it's more likely you'll be searching by text. You could filter this by stage. So if I scroll down here, you'll see some of these are at the final rule stage. Some of them are proposed rule stage. There's some long-term actions, and you can scroll over these and there will be a nice summary of what on earth is going on. So this is all FDA actions, including the tobacco actions, and I would just narrow this down. So for example, here's the tobacco product standard for menthol and cigarettes that was withdrawn, and so this is listed under completing actions, for example. So this is where I would go to get a sense of actions that are coming up. You can also use some really useful systems. If you're part of CTP in specific way, you can go to CASL or similar centres that the FDA's and the CASL staff are very good at putting up. These are the forthcoming public comment opportunities, or these are comment opportunities that are open right now. Okay, so there are a couple of other things you can do in the rulemaking process that people sometimes forget. Anybody can petition for rulemaking to happen. So if we're in a situation where the law says that the FDA should do a particular thing and it hasn't happened, maybe there could be some organization around a petition for rulemaking to occur. You can ask for more time to submit comments, and you will see, because tobacco is contentious, sometimes these public comment opportunities, the closing date gets delayed or things get extended. A comment period can be reopened, so you should watch for that. And there can also be a reply period, so after public comments have been submitted, you can allow another period of public response to those comments. An opportunity that's actually open now is you can comment on guidance. So if I take you to this example, regulations and rules are legally binding. They are the implementation piece, implementing laws and statutes. Guidance is not binding, so this is, and you can see here, You can comment on guidance at any time, but there are specific times when the FDA might solicit guidance in order to try to get timely and relevant information. So, for example, this draft guidance right now is open to comment. You can have a look at the document. This is all on the FDA website. They have a list of guidance documents that are open for comment. So this is something else to maybe watch for as you're doing your monitoring of different opportunities. Okay. So I helpfully put screenshots in the slides. So this is just the FDA track site that we just looked at. Just a little bit on how to find specific public comment opportunities. So this is the slightly jargon heavy bit. Regulations.gov is the site that you want to go to, and I'll show you the main page in a minute. I find it a little easier than the Federal Register, but you can also go to the Federal Register site and do a similar search. So you can imagine that each regulatory action in progress has like a folder. I always think of, because I'm old school, I think of them like a manila folder on paper, and then that folder has a whole bunch of documentation in it. So for the regulatory action in question, you're going to want to find that folder, which is called a docket. I appreciate the old school English language there. So we've got that folder, and you can find it one or two ways. Either it's got an ID number that you can find and search for, or an RIN, which is a number assigned to the regulatory action by OIRA in order to be able to track that across government. So in your folder, you'll have a couple of different things. You'll have documents. So if you have a proposed rule, one of the documents in your folder will be that proposed rule. It's a big single-space text document, hard to navigate. That will also have an ID number, so it's good to note that. Then I will show you in a minute, but with the nicotine standard, we have a whole bunch of supporting material, over 600 different citations, I think. So most of this is in the form of peer-reviewed articles, different people's testimonies, and other records that have been entered into this docket folder by FDA staff. And so that supporting material here, I've got, I searched for David Levy, who's a member of our CASTR Center, and he had several bits of material with his name and the publication date. So if I'm interested in finding out what evidence base the FDA has used to formulate this proposed rule, I can search these too. The third thing you're going to find in this folder is comments. So with the comments, you're looking for, they will be everything from very short comments from individuals through to quite long and complicated documents that are coming from organizations. CASTR did one for the nicotine standard. I've got some other examples that we'll go through for the American Lung Association and a few other different community-based groups. You'll find lots of comments from industry, various kinds, and those tend to be longer and a bit more organized. But all the comments have an ID. So noting these down and keeping track of them if you're following along is a good idea. So let me just quickly show you what these look like. Here's regulations.gov. So this is just the website here. Normally, if I don't have a number to search for, I can put in, I can literally put in tobacco here. I'm going to get a lot of search results, but what I'm looking for in this case is proposed rules. So I'm going to narrow it down by proposed rules. Here is the tobacco product standard that we're going to look at in a minute. And that the comments for that closed in September. If I scroll down, I can pick things by agency as well. So I'm almost certainly going to choose, in this case, FDA. So this provides me with a number of search results. I can also search for things that are have open comment periods at the time if I want the latest opportunities. So at the top here, you'll see we have dockets, documents, and comments. And so let me show you a little bit what each of those looks like. I've got some pre-populated tabs here. So for the tobacco product standard, this is the docket. This is my folder. Here you can see a little summary of what the product standard is, what is the proposed action. Down here is the RIN, which is the regulation identifier number that's identifying this docket uniquely, so I can take a note of that. And so it's giving me the number of comments here posted. Here's the unified agenda. So with this opportunity, it's gone into long-term actions. There's no action on this at the moment. And so at the moment, this is not very helpful information, but at other points in time, this would tell me where we are in the regulatory process. I can also then look at the documents. So here I'm finding this top one that says PR, which is proposed rule with a little blue icon. That's the main thing I'm interested in reading and understanding in order to produce relevant comments. And I'll talk us through that in a minute. And then this last tab is people's comments. So we have, just as I said, here's a comment from the Truth Initiative, which is a longer piece. There's some from named individuals. There's some that are anonymous. A lot of these tend to be pretty short. But I do recommend when you're trying to learn how to do this, reading other people's comments and getting a sense of what you think, using your critical thinking for what you think is good and bad here. Okay, so if I went to the proposed rule document, this is the document that I get. We'll talk through this in a minute, but you can see already it's a lot of information to process, and we don't want to respond to everything that is here. We want to tailor our response to our own expertise, as well as the specific information requests that are coming from FDA. So the important things to note here is I'll know whether the document is open or closed for comments. I'll know when the comment period is, and it will tell me down here, for example, when the comments are due. And we will talk a little bit about the contents of this, but I'll just show you. This is the table of contents, which has like 50 something sections. So we need to approach this with some efficiency, and I have some thoughts about how to do that. I'll also show you, this is what it looks like when we have supporting material. So in the docket are about 600 things. This is David Levy's piece, which has David Levy and Raphael Meza, who are members of our CASTA Center, on it. This is a peer-reviewed article in this case. Okay, and then this is our public comment, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the finding of things is part of the battle, and then the reading of them is the next part of the battle. So, and then this is the guidance that I showed you a little earlier. So this is where we want to slow down a bit and talk a bit more about how to manage this very long document. So the FDA officials put a lot of effort into compiling these documents. So in the example that I will show you, which is the nicotine standard, they have had a whole evidence gathering process that started informally, and review of scientific evidence, conversations with stakeholders. There was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which is a early notification for anybody who's interested in this rule that action is coming, and that involves a lot of public comments being submitted, evidence being looked at. And then now we have had a notice of proposed rulemaking, so we've had a proposed rule formulated by the agency that was open for public comment last year and received several thousand comments. When you go and look at the proposed rule for this nicotine standard, it's 113 single-spaced pages. It's 57 sections. It's a little bit confusing for people encountering this for the first time. How do I navigate this document, and what am I looking for? And so I will say a really important and often overlooked part of producing a good public comment is being able to read this effectively and to absorb the information. So these are my recommendations. We'll look at this together, and I'll show you the relevant parts of the proposed rule document. But Always read the executive summary. I would say that's probably the most concise piece. It's going to give you a good justification for the rule. It's going to go through the major components of this rule. And then you can start to understand the implications relative to your own expertise. So when we're going through this process, the goal is to find the spaces where, me as a researcher or whatever your expertise is, whether you are doing big picture national or international peer-reviewed research, whether you are doing local research or evaluation, whether you are involved in implementation and you have thoughts about how this will play out in terms of how the rule will be implemented and put into practice. All of those things count as evidence and important evidence too, and context for what the FDA needs to hear. So we're going to find that gap, that overlap between my expertise as the reader and the questions that the FDA is asking. In order to do that, I'm just going to educate myself about the executive summary. I will always read the regulatory history because going through comments that were submitted to this opportunity, there's a lot of comments, particularly from like small businesses, that alleged the claim that this regulation was not properly considered and there wasn't enough consultation. If you read the regulatory history, it's super clear there was quite a lot of consultation, especially they had that advanced rulemaking period and then the proposed rulemaking period. And so it's pretty easy to refute that just by reading the history of what actually happened. And that's not something that I, from my position, want to reiterate. I want to provide things that complement the existing narrative and the history that's established in this document, which is really well evidenced. So when I've read the executive summary and the regulatory history, I'm going to look through the rest, especially paying attention to the table of contents, paying attention to keywords, and trying to find those areas where my expertise overlaps with the FDA's interests. And I would encourage people to think both in terms of your subject matter interest, which we're quite good at doing in public health, but also methodologically. So we have within Castor a lot of people who do different forms of modeling, some assessments, including econometric analysis. So do think as you're going through this, how can I help to be very clear about the technical aspects of my work? If I am a modeler, how can I help to explain what are the takeaways from the modeling research that I interact with? So once I've had some thoughts about what those overlapping areas are, and I'll talk about that in a minute, you can seek to reinforce that narrative. Probably the most effective thing is to provide some context. These are very long documents at 113 pages, but there's still stuff in there that's not fully explained, and you might want to provide that context in writing. It might be really important context for interpreting studies. It might be important context that pertains to a particular subgroup in the population. It might be particular context that explains how this has played out in your jurisdiction, your local area, or some jurisdiction that's not the national jurisdiction that's proposed for this proposed regulation. So think about where that context could be provided to not just reiterate what's in the comment, but like reinforce, but also expand upon what's here. You can also argue against the FDA positions in these areas by providing some clarity and context, right? Ideally, you should be highlighting both arguments and evidence that the agency has not considered. And we're going to talk a bit about the balance between data on the one hand, which I think as public health professionals or as part of a public health school, we spend a lot of time teaching our students to care about data and care about evidence-based policy. But we have to balance the presentation of data with a really clear argument. That's one of the most important things that sometimes my students who are just excellent data analysts will struggle with, is the communication piece and making a clear argument for a position. So we're going to have those things in balance, hopefully. especially we're going to highlight arguments and evidence that the agency hasn't considered in this proposed rule document, or expand upon things that it has considered, providing additional context. So another thing to ask yourself, so at the bottom of this very long document is a section that is considerations and request for comments. I will probably pause and pay special attention to that section. So in these proposed rules, the agency will ask specific questions. So I've highlighted here in the box. This is pasted from that section. And so if you look at the bottom, we request comments, data, and research regarding the proposed scope of this rule. So with this proposed rule, this was covering combustibles, and it does not cover vaping and so on. So that was really important because there were a lot of public comments that were targeted very well and responding to this part of the rule, saying, well, the implications of just targeting combustibles from our perspective are this, this, and this. So I would say that's good targeting here. That's responsive to the proposed rule, and that's the kind of thing that you want to do. So I will look through this end section and try to understand, well, what are the considerations or requests coming from the FDA, and especially where does that overlap with my expertise, and what can we provide that helps to answer those questions. Okay, so once you've digested a bit more what's going on here, you're going to sit down and try to write your comment. And I think here I've just tried to put the key items, and I will talk a little bit about each and try to elaborate a bit. So when you look at the Administrative Procedure Act, the Administrative Procedure Act says agencies have to consider comments in this way, and the comments need to be timely, and the comments need to be relevant. So the timely part is a bit easier. Hopefully you are paying attention to the unified agenda when it's published. You are looking ahead, hopefully with some help of organizations like CASTA or CASL or other groups where you can get on a mailing list or look at a website and it's a little easier. But you want to note that public comment period. You can submit comments at other times, but they won't be considered timely unless they're submitted within the comment period. So you need to work backwards. In an organizational context like CASTA, we have to work backwards quite a bit to make sure we're getting buy-in from all our members, because we're representing a bunch of people. And so we will draft something, get approvals, and work on it, polish it, and then submit. So we need to be timely. More difficult, perhaps, is being relevant. So submitting a very general comment, particularly if it doesn't really respond to the document and its core requests, it's not that relevant. It's not that actually helpful. A lot of people will, individuals will cathartically maybe like submit comments that are really sharing their opinions on tobacco control in general. I was reading some of the individual comments for the nicotine standard, and there's quite a few that are like, how dare you, the FDA shouldn't be involved in tobacco control at all, which is a perfectly valid opinion for someone to have, and they're expressing it, but it's not going to fall in the category of relevant. And so submitting a very general comment is not a great idea. In your comment, and I'll give you some examples of this in a minute in the text, you need to lead with your expertise. So with CASTA, we will be describing what on earth are we? What do we do? What kinds of evidence do we generate? Why do we have expertise in this subject matter area? You as an individual, if you're a trainee, if you're a researcher, you might introduce yourself and your credentials and say the kind of work that you do. Whatever organization you're representing, you're going to be giving a bit of an explanation for why your expertise is relevant for this. In your own personal life, you can totally do a different kind of comment where you say, I'm a person, I'm a resident in this place, this is my experience, and this is why my comment is important. But for my professional life, I'm doing this as on behalf of an organization. So lead with your expertise and explain why you're important. The core of this is to try to balance data with expert argument. And I'll show you in a minute when we do our own briefs. The idea here is to try to lead with argument, provide clear argumentary sentences that wrap around the evidence. So the more technical stuff is in there, especially as we're expressing, we're summarizing findings from modeling studies where it's kind of important what kind of modeling this was and how to interpret the results and how to give a sense of magnitude to the findings, right? But at the same time, we want to wrap that around with clear implications for this proposed rule that target especially the parts of the rule where there are specific FDA questions. So we're balancing data and expert argument. I think you need to take a position when you're doing this balancing. Again, if you are trained as a researcher, the temptation might be, and it always is with me, to get real small and cautious and balance and show all the caveats to your research. To some extent, whilst remaining true to the evidence, you have to fight that tendency to go down a rabbit hole with the detail. You will have the citations will be provided, you are summarizing what's there. And you have to take a position. And so it might be a subtle position that says, we think FDA should change the rule in this way. We think that the FDA's proposed rule has implications for this group in the population, or how people will switch products. So we can have nuance in there, but we do have to take a position. We do have to provide a conclusion. We're going to try also to counter some expected opposing arguments. So this is where reading the other people's comments comes in. So frequently cited complaint on the nicotine standard was this will increase illicit trade in this way. And that was a commonly cited argument. So we saw that in other people's comments and just in general in terms of the kinds of positions that get taken when responding to this kind of regulations. And we tried to anticipate that a little bit and provide evidence that we had, an interpretation of peer-reviewed evidence that could refute that a bit. Across all of this, trying to balance evidence and data, clarity is the most important thing. And that can mean procedural things like put the docket number in a title with the proposed rule title, the exact wording at the top, so people can find you, figure out what contact information you want to provide for yourself. Comments can be submitted anonymously, but for this kind of expert commentary, we are relying more on you saying, oh, this is my institutional affiliation, this is my expertise, and so I would expect you to put some contact information in there. Do all the good things that your hardworking professors who teach you writing in college will tell you to do. So spell out the acronyms, use plain language that's direct as much as you can. Use a plain machine-readable font. All of those good things. As you structure your comment, I would recommend thinking really carefully about search terms. So we're constructing something that could form part of an online public searchable evidence base for future regulation, future litigation, other debate around this type of policy, not just in the US, but all over the place. So it's a great idea to use subheadings with keywords. Maybe some of those keywords you're reflecting back to headings and other key terms that are used in the proposed rule document from the FDA itself. So there is a trend at the moment that I've seen of people using hashtags too, so that it's easier for legal teams to search through public comments and find particular sections. I don't see that happening in tobacco control particularly. I think it's a little bit more associated with like mass mailing campaigns, but that's something to consider. How can you use words or terms that help and someone else come into your information a long time later? How can you help them navigate and find your arguments? I think I'm a fan of using some bolded sentences to summarize your main points. Would caution people to on thinking about use of visuals. They're not normally used very much in this kind of submission. Doesn't mean you can't use them, but sometimes you have to be very careful about the way that that visual maybe communicates your point. And regardless, you absolutely should include the same point in the main text. You can reach out with questions to a named person. If I go to, where am we? Oh, here we are. This is the document details. If I scroll all the way to the bottom of this proposed rule, there's always a named person. So if there's something about this rule, because it's super complicated, that you don't understand, do feel free to reach out. That is something that's totally legitimate to do. And I would urge everybody who is a researcher or doing this as part of maybe your training, try to build public comments into your project dissemination plan as a relatively cost-free way to get findings out there. Particularly, FDA is interested in seeing grants, and NIH is interested in seeing grants that include consideration of public comment as part of your dissemination strategy, with thinking about the broader application of your research. Okay. So the don'ts are a little shorter because they're kind of the inverse of this. And then I'm going to go through some examples and then we'll have a couple questions. So don't make your poor suffering officials who have to read and go through a lot of these comments work harder than they need to. So think about the clarity of your writing. Think about the length of your comments. Don't write a very long comment, mostly because a very long comment won't necessarily have a greater impact than a short one. Comments don't necessarily have to be of a particular length. But when I teach this and I have in-class exercises, I will say, please do a few pages, sometimes 2 or 4. It does not have to be 50 pages. And I think a shorter piece is more effective. So don't feel like you need to respond to all parts of the proposed rules. So you're going to go through, be selective, sticking to that area of overlap between your expertise and the specific questions. Don't ignore the public comments when you're project planning. You do need a bit of a time run up to be able to plan this effectively and produce a good document, even though it might not be a huge amount of work to write a small bit of text for this. You should refine it and think about it because it's going to be in the public sphere in a more permanent way once it's submitted. Okay. So I want to take you through a comment that was submitted by Castor for the nicotine standard proposed rule that happened last year. And so just some very simple things at the beginning. If you can go to our docket here and find us. Just if you search for Castor, we come up right away. But we've got the docket number here. We've got a title. People obsess quite a bit about the to and from. I wouldn't worry about that too much, but it does need to be identifiable. And then in the first page, right up the top, we're introducing who we are. In this case, we have a hyperlink. The hyperlinks are clickable when these are uploaded to the system, so feel free to do that if you like. I think it's a little better to have full references, though, for anything that is a peer-reviewed piece of research. So we've explained who we are straight at the top. Look how big these subheadings are. I thought this was great. Several people worked on this, but especially the fantastic Jamie Tam and Claire Marr. And I really like this approach because there's quite a bit of white space. It's easy to read. You can tell that some people who've had to look at a lot of public comments wrote this because it's quite a grinding experience to have to sit down and go through the stuff. So we're trying to make it easy for the reader. We're reflecting here in this paragraph at the top, consistent with the FDA's own modelling analyses. So we're demonstrating that we've read the proposed rule and responded to it, and that we are echoing in this part some of the findings that the FDA includes in its proposed rule. I hope you can see just from these 2 paragraphs, we have introductory sentences and argumentative sentences throughout, and then we have quite a bit of technical detail. So we're explaining what the results indicate with as much clarity as we can. Especially with our modeling, it's important to try to understand the time period specifically, as well as the magnitude of lives saved. We've included in this comment a lot of subheadings that say, this is our argument. We're using that. We've got keywords in here: mental health. It's a nicotine product standard. We're talking about smoking. And so this is using research that's specific to our CASTR researchers. It's quite cutting edge and fresh research. You can, if you have research in progress, include unpublished research, include things in progress, include local data, especially if you have a local survey or evaluation. That can be super useful. Just providing that you indicate very clearly, if it's not peer-reviewed research, what is the basis for this analysis? And so we've tied here together some evaluation of existing pieces of research which reflects what the FDA has in the proposed rule, and we're trying to highlight those and build an argument that then leads to this second part where we're talking about our research, which might be less known by the FDA officials, but we're trying to highlight the importance here. Here we have some examples of how to refute, provide some counter arguments. So after we've made some main points, we're moving on to trying to counteract and integrate those counter arguments to really common arguments that might come up. So the FDA officials can't really go through and say, well, they do a little bit in this one. This is a common argument that's made. Here's a bunch of evidence that actually refutes that. This is what we think the evidentiary or scientific picture actually is. And we're trying to mirror that a bit, including some expertise and some studies that are specific to us as CASTR. And so weaving those two things together can be pretty effective. And then we remembered to end with a recommendation. Always, it's clear to see from this, this is what we recommend. We have an echo of that at the beginning and the end of the comment. So this is an example of quite a technical comment. You can have a look at some of these other ones we have here. I tried to pick some from different sides of the argument. So this is the American Petroleum and Convenience Store Association. And what I think could have been better done here is they've put all the text in here, which is perfectly okay. They've got some clear talking points and summaries of what their main arguments are. They have a very commonly cited argument that this rule was proposed under the previous administration, therefore it should just now be thrown away, which is not how the process works. And attached to that, a very commonly cited argument that the FDA didn't follow the correct process in this. But that's a bit of a waste of time for them to argue that. It's very clearly articulated in the proposed rule, the steps that the FDA took. So I don't think it really holds water. Where the strength here might be is trying to talk about how this affects their industry, right? So it's the same principles for those people on the other side of the argument. I think they're more effective when they're talking about specifically implementation challenges, technical challenges, economic challenges that may be debated. I obviously don't think they're correct, but in those aspects, they're a little better in this proposed, this public comment response. So here is ours. I just wanted to take you through finally. So I've talked about how to go through this, but let me just show you practically. This is the proposed rule document. So this is your 113 pages of text, which I will not go through. But you can see at the top, there's a summary. Immediately, I would scroll down and start to look at this table of contents. And especially the piece I'm looking for, apart from the executive summary that's at the top and the background on what was the regulatory history for this specific measure, which is quite important in tobacco because we quite often have delayed measures or multiple opportunities for consideration for a particular policy and it fails and then we go back to that. I will also look at the end here where we've got additional considerations and requests for comment, specifically these letter pieces. So you can see that when we wrote our response, a lot of people who responded to this considered the scope of products and talked about combustibles. We also looked at potential for illicit trade. So I think what I want to hammer home is that reading this and understanding it and then being relevant in your response is really the core of this. At that moment, I'm going to stop for a minute and see if people have specific questions. I don't see any in the chat. Feel free to put them in the chat or just ask me. I could talk a bit more candidly too about the struggles of trying to do this as a group or the challenges of trying to mix very technical research articles with some hopefully clearly accessible communication.
Jamie has her hand up, Holly.
Oh, sorry, I can't see everyone's nice faces. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Holly. Thank you so much for going over that. It was actually really fun to work on that comment
Yeah.
with you and the PADCOR. I think my question is more open-ended. I think you walk through the process to submit a comment to a proposed rule, but
Yes.
most of the stuff that FDA puts out are not proposed rule. It's like guidance documents.
Yes.
What record keeping requirements. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about, how you might approach that similarly or differently. These sort of, they have dockets that are not specifically for a rule.
Yeah, exactly. So if we go to the
And I guess I don't know if I guess we have Jonathan on the call as well. If any of our friends in federal government have thoughts about that.
because we have the draft guidance for industry at the moment on flavored ends. And so this is something where, again, you want to be timely. You can submit guidance comments at any stage, but ideally you want to be responsive to the kinds of questions that FDA has. And here, this is just the main FDA webpage, but you can go to the Federal Register and have a look at this. Again, you've got a draft guidance document. So a similar situation in terms of it's going to be quite a long document. I think you need to be specific to thinking about, again, from my public health perspective, like what is going to be the effects of this maybe on if I know data or I have specific thoughts about the differential effects between groups. I might want to talk about that. If I have some expertise in thinking about markets or economic consequences of doing this, I might want to think about that and present that from a health perspective. I might want to think about what others are going to comment on this. So this is the guidance. So it's not binding, but it's still detailed and it engages quite a bit with the FDA's current approach. It's the bread and butter of what a lot of FDA folks are doing every day. And it's been a huge point of contention in terms of trying to get marketing authorization and other applications through. And so again, you've got evidence here being cited in the guidance. You might want to think in a bigger picture way about Is there evidence that's not included? We're cited as the CASTA members are cited quite a bit in here. Is there context that you want to provide on things that are already included, or in a similar way, do you actually want to highlight things that are not included in the background or in the consideration for these? Especially if you can think about what you suspect some industry responses will be. Are there other perspectives, particularly public health perspectives, that need to be in here? And I'll be quiet because being on the call with other people who also do this for a living. Couple of questions from Claire. How long might we aim to take to write a good public comment? That's an interesting question. I don't know how much time you have, would be part of that. And then how are public comments reviewed? Especially, do we know how this might be changing with federal interest in integrating AI, which is an interesting question. It's not one where I have a whole bunch of expertise necessarily about how that's unfolding. I would say, how long should you take? You're going to have a particular amount of time. Sometimes you'll find out, hopefully you're on the ball and keeping a track of the agenda, but not everybody is so connected. So you might be finding out about something a little bit later. I would do your best. It's better to write a short, coherent, clear comment rather than trying to address every part of a proposed rule and maybe overstretching yourself. I know that we were definitely, when we were doing that comment, Jamie, we had a bunch more things that we wanted to respond to, and we tried to triage a little bit to say, this is really where we need to focus our efforts. I will leave the comment on AI for other folks, but I think it's potentially a huge change. It is something that's been discussed in the context of regulations in general. This is a huge amount of data in public comments, and it's normally passed by humans, but it can be also passed by machine. And so it really does matter what the quality of that is, and whether or not that's actually going to produce good, adequate scrutiny of these comments that would hold up in court in the future. I think that's a big regulatory question. Thank you so much, Jamie. All right, it's 4 o'clock. I realize I got to wrap up. If anyone else has lasting comments, please feel free to email me. I will put my email right now in the chat, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you.